Hello, my name is Katherine, and today I'm going to be discussing eating disorders in relation to race, COVID-19, and caregivers. So here's my agenda. I first look at my abstract, introduction, eating disorders in relation to race, COVID-19, caregivers, and I look at my infographics and conclusion. This presentation reviews the modern day barriers to eating disorders, EDs, diagnosis and treatment. I review the lack of ED diagnoses within minorities, as well as COVID-19's impact on eating disorder treatment. I then evaluate the burden on caregivers and how they can be best supported. If more research were done on each of these areas, it would help health professionals improve the treatment process, allowing people of all ethnicities to recover from disordered eating and live a long, healthy life. Eating disorders, as defined by the APA Dictionary of Psychology, are abnormal disturbances in eating behavior and attitude. Out of all the mental disorders, EDs have the highest mortality rate. There are several different types of eating disorders, but the most common ones are bulimia nervosa, BN, anorexia nervosa, AN, and binge eating disorder, BED. There is no one single cause of eating disorder. Instead, it is fueled by many factors, both environmental and genetics. For example, eating disorders can be spurred on by history of sexual abuse, cultural norms, as well as body dissatisfaction. Genetics also play a role, such as the change in the amount of serotonin and dopamine in the brain. Despite the rise in eating disorder diagnosis, treatment centers continue to advertise images of young, skinny Caucasian women. Inevitably, this can lead to the false assumption that EDs are exclusive only to white young girls. This misleading perception can impede diagnosis among people of color, POC, as they believe that they as many believe that they are immune to eating disorders. However, there's also a multitude of factors contributing to the hindrance of care and diagnosis, including the cost of care and racial stereotypes. Though the beginnings of the coronavirus disease, COVID-19, may have negatively impacted eating disorder recovery, empty grocery stores may have amplified fears, especially since there's less of a food selection. Furthermore, there has been a shift from in-person appointments to virtual ones, which has reduced responsibility among some ED patients due to the lack of in-person measures, such as weigh-ins. Researchers also found an increase in eating disorder symptoms during the pandemic, such as the need for physical activity, weight concerns, and eating, as well as feelings of loneliness and sadness. However, looking at the positive side, patients were also able to develop successful coping strategies during the pandemic, which we will discuss later. Much of an ED recovery process is done by caregivers, so they're an integral piece to full recovery. Yet, their needs are often overlooked. Caregivers can experience high levels of psychological stress, such as anxiety or depression. Oftentimes, caregivers are worried about the lack of information regarding treatment and lack of support from relatives. Evidently, there needs to be more research done on the effects of eating disorders on caregivers. Their needs should be evaluated and met, as eating disorders play a huge part in their lives. Racism and stereotypes are prevalent in disorder diagnoses, preventing early diagnosis and treatment. For one, because low-income families are more likely to be headed by an immigrant, this could mean that the cost of ED care is too expensive for our minorities. Furthermore, clinician bias can indirectly impact diagnosis, such as the language of describing ED diagnoses. For example, a study actually found that race influenced the description of a patient's symptoms. A notable finding was when a health professional was presented with an African American patient. I think they believed that poverty may have been a cause. This is noteworthy as this was never a reason when the patient identified as Asian or Caucasian. Future studies should take into account of how to increase clinicians' awareness of racial stereotypes and how they can affect their patients with this study in mind. Pandemic has increased ED symptoms, with recommendations to stay inside, urge to exercises increase, especially since exercise has been seen as one of the last few available freedoms. Additionally, because people are spending more time online, anorexia nervosa patients, specifically fears of gaining weight, can be amplified due to messages theorizing weight gain during the pandemic. The pandemic has also added to patients' fear, anxiety, and depression. Some has also experienced sharp declines in sadness and loneliness. This may, in part, however, be due to the fear of the unknown introduced by the pandemic. However, looking at the good side, the pandemic has made patients more independent. They have been able to self manage themselves through yoga, hobbies, and daily routines. With this in mind, future studies can take into account and should and take into account these self management activities and evaluate whether or not they can be applied to treatment. Caregivers provide around 4.45 hours of care per week, totaling up to 6 weeks of care annually. One popular ED treatment, family based therapy, is an approach that essentially tasks the patient's family with monitoring the patient's eating and physical exercise. For example, for AM patients, eating disorders treatment, their eating choices and physical activity are controlled by the parents. For BED patients, the target outcome of treatment is to curb the cycle of binging and purging. During the treatment, many caregivers face daunting responsibilities such as the need to monitor their charges eating, changing meal plans in order to better suit the patient's ED treatment plan, as well as responding to quick mood changes that can cause tension within the family. With so many responsibilities, it is no wonder many caregivers may experience burnout and a deterioration in mental health. So here are my infographics. I first look at the impact of racism on eating disorder diagnosis and treatment. For example, undergrad students in one study identified an eating disorder easier than in a white female than in minorities. Next, I took a look into COVID-19's impact on eating disorders. The pandemic, for example, has reduced self-managed care for some patients because of the decrease in the use of in-person measures. For example, when I talked earlier about the weigh-ins. Caregivers during the pandemic also felt they were overwhelmed by the increase in the amount of responsibilities, especially with the reduced support from health professionals. Then I look into how are caregivers impacted by eating disorders. Caregivers who maintain social support are less likely to have a deterioration in mental health as opposed to those who didn't, in one study. Oftentimes, caregivers with a younger patient usually have a higher level of burden than those with older patients. Conclusion. All in all, it is extremely important to continue to evaluate the effects of eating disorders on patients and caregivers. Future studies needs to continue to analyze and improve clinicians' training in regards to diagnosis among people of color. Specifically, they need to focus on racial stereotypes, societal expectations, and cultural norms in order to best treat all ED patients. Furthermore, it is valuable to assess the consequences of COVID-19, such as its effects on motivation for recovery and chances of relapse. Finally, scholars should focus on investigating and meeting caregivers' needs as extremely important to helping people or patients recover from ED treatment, ED diagnosis. Thank you for listening to my presentation.
Hi, my name is Natasha Cardozo, and today I am discussing the preventative measures for Alzheimer's disease. Here is an overview of Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's disease is the leading cause of dementia. It is a degenerative disease, meaning it worsens over time. People with Alzheimer's disease may have the disease 20 years before they start showing visible symptoms. It causes a decline in cognitive abilities and eventually affects physical health, preventing patients from performing daily activities such as dressing, eating, or walking. The brain has billions of neurons or nerve cells that help it carry out its functions. In a healthy brain, communication between neurons occurs at a rapid pace. In Alzheimer's disease, neurons are destroyed and communication between neurons is delayed. Neurons become dysfunctional starting in the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain involved in memory. The destruction of neurons progressively spreads to other parts of the brain, affecting processes such as processing speed, executive functioning, emotional processing. This intensifies with age. The most common symptom of Alzheimer's disease is memory loss. There are many other cognitive impairments that occur as a part of Alzheimer's disease. These symptoms include language, judgment, visuospatial, and attention problems. Patients with Alzheimer's disease often have difficulties performing activities of daily living independently. This disease is most prominent in older people, but early symptoms such as memory loss or lack of proper judgment can appear in younger patients. Here are some of the causes of Alzheimer's disease. The two main causes are plaques and tangles. Plaques are formed by an accumulation of proteins around the brain, and tangles are formed as a result of the misfolding of the protein tau. To go more in depth, tubule-associated unit tau is responsible for maintaining the stability of microtubules that form the exterior of the cell. You can see in this diagram that there is a healthy microtubule and an Alzheimer's microtubule. Sometimes tau is folded wrong, which creates neurofibrillary tangles. The irregular shape of the misfolded tau protein causes it to be insoluble, which blocks communication between neurons. As we discussed before, this lack of communication between neurons is what leads to Alzheimer's disease. Amyloid beta is a protein that aids in the growth of neurons. The accumulation of this protein and several other proteins create senile plaques. Plaques, as you can see in the diagram, are formed in the brain and they are composed of amyloid beta and other components. There are several types of amyloid beta, including several insoluble proteins which accumulate to form senile plaques. Since amyloid beta regularly facilitates neural functioning, having a denser accumulation of senile plaques can cause major impairment in cognitive functioning, leading to Alzheimer's disease dementia. The three major preventative factors that we are going to be discussing in this presentation are physical activity, cognitive training, and blood pressure management. Clinical trials have shown that certain protective factors can aid in reducing the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease or in preventing the onset of the disease itself. These protective factors protect against the formation of amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles, which is beneficial in preventing Alzheimer's disease. To start off, we have physical activity. The first step to preventing Alzheimer's disease is maintaining a healthy lifestyle. Exercise is a crucial component in maintaining a healthy heart. Physical activity is capable of preventing 35 medical conditions, most of which are related to the cardiovascular system. Studies show that having a strong cardiovascular system improves overall health, which then can help prevent Alzheimer's disease. Atrial fibrillation is the most common type of irregular heartbeat and is a major risk factor for not only Alzheimer's disease, but many forms of dementia. This shows how increasing and maintaining heart health through physical activity can be beneficial for Alzheimer's disease. This is physical activity in relation to plaques. Exercise is also proven to be effective in reducing the prevalence of amyloid beta plaques. A study shows that rats that run on a treadmill have shown a lower level of senile plaques. This could be because during exercise, the pituitary gland in our brain releases the human growth hormone, which accelerates protein synthesis and reduces the buildup of proteins in the brain. As you can see in the diagram above, there is the pituitary gland in the brain, and it says that it makes and releases the human growth hormone. The formation of senile plaques is due to the buildup of certain proteins in the brain. By exercising, we reduce the buildup of proteins through the pituitary gland and thereby reduce the risk for Alzheimer's disease. Now we will discuss physical activity in relation to tangles. Exercising also increases the brain's oxygen intake, which helps prevent misfolding of proteins and ensures that protein synthesis is able to occur. In the diagram above, you can see how protein synthesis is occurring at a rapid pace and in the correct order. Without increased oxygen intake to the brain, there are often misfoldings which can lead to certain proteins, such as tau, misfold and lead to the formation of tangles. With the benefits of exercise, such as an increase in overall physical and heart health, human growth hormones, and increased oxygen intake to the brain, the formation of plaques and tangles is reduced, which reduces the risk of Alzheimer's disease overall. Next, we have cognitive training. Cognitive training is a strategy used by many patients with dementia to improve memory and other mental skills. It involves activities such as memorizing lists or solving puzzles to increase the cognitive capacity of the brain. A research study on traumatic brain injuries shows that cognitive training significantly helps strengthen the plasticity of the hippocampus, allowing the brain to heal at a faster rate. Cognitive training is especially helpful for older adults suffering from neurological conditions such as Alzheimer's disease. As it helps improve and maintain the integrity of the hippocampus, it allows people to retain their memory, which aids in reducing the clinical symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. As we discussed earlier, the hippocampus is what controls memory in patients. So by increasing cognitive training and benefiting the hippocampus, we're able to prevent the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. Cognitive training in relation to plaques and tangles. There does not seem to be a direct link between cognitive training and plaques and tangles, but there are still ways to use this method to reduce the prevalence of plaques and tangles. TREM2 is a gene that causes inflammation in the brain and accelerates the buildup of plaques and tangles. By engaging in cognitive training, we can reduce the incidence of this gene and prevent cognitive impairment in the brain. In the diagram above, we can see red inflamed spots that are caused due to the TREM2 gene. So by reducing the incidence of this gene, we can prevent this inflammation, prevent the formation of plaques and tangles, which will help prevent the risk of Alzheimer's disease. Lastly, we will discuss blood pressure management. Research has shown that hypertension is a major risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. Hypertension is characterized by a blood pressure higher than 140/90. An elevated blood pressure causes more pressure to be needed for blood to get across blood vessels. Managing blood pressure can help us reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease. Many studies have linked diets to the progression of Alzheimer's disease. Following a diet that helps maintain a healthy blood pressure aids in the prevention of Alzheimer's disease. Saturated fatty acids that lead to hypertension have proven to have a negative correlation with cognitive function and Alzheimer's disease, confirming that elevated blood pressures can lead to this disease. As mentioned before, heart disease or heart complications are a major risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. Hypertension is a leading cause of heart disease. So by maintaining a proper blood pressure, individuals can protect their overall heart health. Above in the diagram, we can see that there are foods crossed out, which include many fatty acids that are not good for you and create elevated blood pressures, and foods that are healthier that will aid in maintaining the proper blood pressure, reducing the incidence of heart disease, which will help us prevent Alzheimer's disease. Now we have blood pressure management in relation to plaques and tangles. Studies on animals have shown that plaques and tangles occur soon after an encounter with hypertension. These plaques are formed from an accumulation of certain proteins. Having a high blood pressure can cause buildup, making it easier for these proteins to gather in blood vessels. Furthermore, tangles result from the misfolding of the protein tau, and a high blood pressure can make it easier for these proteins to misfold. In the diagram, you can see how the plaque buildup in the blood vessel causes a higher blood pressure, which can make it easier for proteins to accumulate in that small gap and create plaques and tangles. Lastly, these are my references. Thank you for listening to my presentation.
Hello everyone, my name is Shrinithi and this is my study on the prevalence and factors of myopia for children in East Asia and India. As I have high myopia, which is defined as a prescription above -6 diopters, I have experienced a variety of treatments, ranging from eye drops to contact lenses to even natural Ayurvedic treatments in India. Therefore, nearsightedness has played a very significant role in my childhood, prompting my interest in this subject. Myopia has been cited as a major 21st century public health problem, and is projected to affect 50% of the world's population by 2050. Especially with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, nearsightedness has been increasing as we stay indoors and in front of screens. To provide some background on how myopia works, faraway objects can be seen clearly with normal vision. But in the nearsighted eye, as the eyeball is too long, light does not fully reach the back of the eye, causing faraway objects to appear blurrier. High myopia comes with the risk of glaucoma, retinal detachment, and other eye conditions, which is why it is critical to prevent its progression as soon as possible. Although nearsightedness has been increasing across the world, I wanted to focus my research on Asia, which has very widespread prevalences. Most notably, East Asia has seen a significant rise in the prevalence of myopia. So the countries I have studied are China, Japan, and India, and I have observed genetic, education, and dietary factors on the prevalence of myopia in children. First, let's take a look at China. A study done from children in ages 6 to 9 found that genetic factors and environmental factors may make up the progression of myopia by 12.5% and 87.5% respectively. Furthermore, another study done in Shenzhen, China, found the prevalence of myopia in students to be 46.9%, and in 2020, this number increased to 50.5%. Now, many studies have shown that children with myopic parents are more likely to develop myopia, and this has been proved in a study done in Guangzhou, China, where children with myopia had an overall positive association based on the number of myopic parents they had, as can be seen below. Next, moving on to the educational environment. The phenomenon of education fever is very well renowned in many Asian countries, as parents are heavily involved in their children's education and set high expectations for their scholastic performance. A study done in Eastern China found that students from urban schools showed higher rates of myopia prevalence, high myopia, and vision impairment due to the fact that they were in a more intensive educational environment. Another study investigating near-work factors, which are activities done at a close distance, found that the amount of hours doing homework and watching TV were higher in myopic students compared to non-myopic students. Close reading distance and even close nib to fingertip distance while writing were associated with greater myopia in Chinese 7th graders. Next, when we take a look at the Chinese diet, there has been a general shift from a predominantly plant-based diet to a Western-style diet, high in fat and animal foods. The Chinese population has seen an overall increased fat intake and a decreased intake of carbohydrates, energy, and protein. So a study investigating myopia and dietary factors in Chinese school children used a food frequency questionnaire, and it found that higher saturated fat and cholesterol were associated with longer axial length, which is the length of the eyeball. Next, let's move on to Japan. While there are fewer studies on the prevalence of myopia in Japan compared to China, one study found that out of students from ages 6 to 11, 76.5% had myopia, while out of students from ages 12 to 14, 94.9% had myopia. To provide some context for a study I will cite below, I will define what visual acuity is, which is the ability of the eye to distinguish shapes and the details of objects at a given distance, like how well we can read a visual chart. And factors that can affect visual acuity include nearsightedness, farsightedness, and astigmatism. So a study done in Hiroshima, Japan, found factors related to poorer visual acuity, and below we see trends very similar to the study shown in China. Next, the past education policy in Japan was very intensive, with an emphasis on university entrance examinations. So the Yutori policy was introduced as a less intensive educational environment. It reduced the time spent on primary subjects like math and English and gave attention to integrated learning, such as problem solving and critical thinking. This reduced practices like cramming and rote learning that students used to perform. So the previous study on PVA found that there was an association with time spent studying and reading books, as in the non-PVA group, students spent an average of 2 hours studying, while in the PVA group, there was an average of 3 hours spent studying. Next, moving on to the Japanese traditional diet called washoku, which has been known as a very important factor in the longevity of Japanese people. It is characterized by a high consumption of fish and soybean products and a low consumption of animal fat and meat, contrary to the Western diet. So, a study done in Kagoshima found that the intake of westernized food increases the serum cholesterol in Japanese Americans. This is associated with a higher BMI, and in turn, higher BMI has been found to have a positive and significant correlation with axial length. Finally, we will be taking a look at India. Although India has one of the largest child populations in the world, it has a lack of adequate national prevalence data on the prevalence of myopia in children. However, I was able to find one study which showed that in 1999, the prevalence went from 4.44% all the way to 21.15% in 2019. Although there are very few studies on parental myopia, like China and Japan, I was able to find one study from the Regional Institute of Ophthalmology. Out of its patients, those with a prevalence of childhood myopia were 16.5%, and those who had a family history of myopia made up 18.53%. The North India Myopia Study details significant risk factors for myopia progression in education, including the hours of reading and writing per week and the use of computers. Furthermore, they also found that higher grades in school and accelerated learning streams had a very strong association with myopia. In turn, the prevalence of myopia was significantly less in children who are playing greater than 2 hours a day. And this corresponds to many findings proving that outdoor activity significantly inhibits the progression of myopia. Finally, let's take a look at diet. Whereas in North India, wheat is a very common staple, South India features a more rice-based diet. While I was unable to find any studies showing a very clear correlation between diet and myopia, I found one study in which the Indian diet was compared to the Eat Lancet diet, which is a global planetary health diet standard. It found that diets in India tend to be low in fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, but high in salt, sugar, and fat, responsible for India's increasing disease burden. And the past studies in this presentation have shown that higher fat is associated with an increase in axial length, showing myopia. So what can we do to prevent myopia or stop it from progressing in children? First, we can start with lifestyle changes, such as reducing near work activities. We can reduce the distance we spend in front of the TV or when we read a book, and we can also increase the time we spend outdoors. Finally, we can make use of myopia control treatments, such as orthokeratology lenses, which are worn overnight and have been proven to be very safe and effective in reducing myopia progression in children. In addition, atropine drops have also shown the same effect. These are the references used in my study. Thank you very much for listening.
Hello everyone, I am Katherine Rojit presenting about factors influencing the long-term effects of meningitis. I worked on this project along with my mentor Connor. Before we begin, a little bit about me. I am a senior at the Samitha Academy in Bangalore, India. My academic interests include psychology and Greek mythology, and when I am free, I usually paint or listen to music. For my presentation today, I will begin with a brief introduction about meningitis, followed by a discussion on how various factors impact the long-term effects of meningitis. As we all know, meningitis is a disease that affects the brain. It is an inflammation of the fluid and membrane, the meninges surrounding the brain and spinal cord. Meningitis can be caused by viruses or bacteria. When a person is infected with meningitis, there is a bacterial invasion from the bloodstream to the central nervous system. The diagnostic hallmark of this disease is the presence of leukocytes or white blood cells in the cerebrospinal fluid. Products of the activated leukocytes, like nitric oxide and matrix metalloproteases and others, contribute to the damage of the blood-brain barrier. The most reliable method to diagnose meningitis is to extract cerebrospinal fluid through a procedure known as the lumbar puncture. Methods like gram staining and immunosynthetase assay can also be used for determining if a person has meningitis. Meningitis is usually treated using the antibiotic cephalosporin, especially clavulan and rosifin. Several other antibiotics have been effective to treat meningitis in adults and children, although they have not been shown to lower mortality or morbidity. As the saying goes, prevention is better than cure. Vaccines, usually polysaccharides or conjugated polysaccharides, are available for preventing meningitis. The major long-term effects of meningitis include cognitive deficits, bilateral hearing loss, motor deficits, seizures, visual impairment, and psychiatric disorders. The minor long-term effects include learning difficulties, behavioral problems, unilateral hearing loss, diplopia, which is seeing double, and hypertonia, which is decreased muscle tone. Not everyone has the same after effects once the initial treatment is over. While some patients recover completely, others seem to have after effects that can greatly reduce the quality of life. Our research indicated that four factors mainly influence the longer lasting outcome of meningitis. These factors are age, sex, biological factors, and socioeconomic factors. Age plays a major role in determining the after effects of the disease. Meningitis in the neonatal period increases the probability of having health and developmental problems with a higher prevalence of neuromotor disabilities, seizure disorders, and learning difficulties. Meningitis in infancy is linked to middle ear disease, visual and behavioral problems. Meningitis in childhood is linked to abnormalities in IQ score, school behavior, neuropsychological functioning, and figure ground differentiation. While comparing the prevalence of after effects, it is noticed that males tend to have higher disturbance in the blood-brain barrier. This makes men more susceptible to long-term after effects. Comparatively, women demonstrate better recovery rates when treated with steroids. However, women have a higher mortality rate due to cryptococcal meningitis. Genetic makeup of an individual also plays a significant role in the outcome of meningitis. Various genes regulate the intensity of the inflammatory and coagulation response to infection. With a disease like meningitis, where prompt medical care is key to making recovery, socioeconomic factors play a major role in determining the after effects as well. So, long term effects are most noticeable in infants from a weaker socioeconomic background. In the future, it will be interesting to explore the after effects of meningitis in adults and also the impact of environmental factors on the effects of meningitis. I would like to conclude with listing my references, and I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to my mentor Connor for his guidance and encouragement throughout the project. Also, thanks to the team at Polygons for providing us with this global platform to present our research. Wishing you all a wonderful day. Signing off, Catherine Rojit.
Hello, my name is Elichi Edward Fujiwara, and I'll be talking about the heat transfer and climate change. So first of all, I'm going to be talking about the background of heat transfer. I'm going to go over the basic three different modes of heat transfer, which are conduction, convection, and radiation. Firstly, conduction is the transfer of heat through direct contact or direct interaction between two objects of different temperature. In the example shown on the right, you can see conduction between the heated up handle of the boiling pot and the human hand. In this case, the heated up handle of the boiling pot transfers its heat to the human hand through direct contact or interaction, and warms up the hand. Convection is the transfer of heat due to the movement of fluid, which can be seen in the diagram by the water boiling and the arrows, which shows the movement of the fluid of the boiling water. And you can see the molecules as well. And the heat is being transferred from the hot to cold molecules through the movement of the fluid. And lastly, radiation is the transfer of heat in the process where heat waves are emitted. And as you can see here, there's waves being emitted of heat, which warms up a colder body, in this case, which is the entire pot in the system. Next, we're going to talk more deeply into radiation. So first of all, here I'm going to focus more on solar radiation specifically, which is radiation that is emitted by the sun that heats the earth, which is the major source of what heats up the earth. And the heat transfer due to the radiation is due to the emission of electromagnetic waves, which is also known as thermal radiation. And here is the diagram of electromagnetic waves. And because it is emitted in the form of waves, it also has wavelengths. And the energy of the radiation, the heat, the energy of the radiation is inversely proportional to the wavelength. So as you can see in the diagram, shorter wavelengths have higher energy, as you can see with this arrow, and longer wavelengths, such as radio waves, microwaves, and infrared waves, have lower energy of the heat. Something also worth noting is black body radiation. Black body is an ideal physical body that absorbs all electromagnetic light, hence the name black, since absorbing all of the visible light will lead to a black body. And here is the black body radiation spectrum, which scales with the temperature and shows that temperature with higher temperature, the wavelength like also scales with the temperature. And next, I'm going to be talking about climate change and how climate change is essentially a heat transfer problem and can be shown with heat transfer. So as I mentioned before, the major source of heat on the Earth is the radiation, solar radiation that's incoming from the sun. And as you can see in the diagram, there are incoming solar radiation, and here it gives us the heat flux of the solar radiation, the energy flow or heat flux of the solar radiation. And some of the energy coming from the solar radiation is reflected directly by the clouds in the atmosphere back into the outer space. Some of it is absorbed by the surface here, and some of the heat absorbed by the surface is then re-radiated back to the atmosphere, or some are also reflected by the surface and reaches the outer space. And some of the energy that gets re-radiated, they tend to be longer wavelength energy, such as infrared. They sometimes get re-radiated, reabsorbed by greenhouse gases and re-radiated back onto the Earth, which you can see in this part of the diagram. And so I'm going to focus more on the Earth energy balance, which can be seen well in the a lot of the diagram. High photon energies tend to be reflected, and low energies tend to get absorbed and like re-radiated. The net heat flux scales with the temperature, and the net heat flux can be seen here with the Stefan-Boltzmann law. It says that P is the power rated in terms of watts. And here, if we just simply divide the surface area, then we get watts per square meter, which is the heat flux, net heat flux. And it scales directly with radiation. And here, this equation demonstrates the heat flux due to solar radiation. And in this case, because the sun is considered almost a black body, the emissivity value is basically equal to 1. Now I'm going to be focusing more about climate change and heat transfer. And the climate change happens when basically the net heat flux isn't 0, because the meaning behind that is that if the net heat flux isn't 0, then that shows that there is a transfer of heat going on. So the Earth is getting warmed up by this solar radiation. And there's also the greenhouse effect, which is shown in the diagram to the right. And what the greenhouse effect basically is that some of the solar radiation is absorbed by the surface of the Earth, and the Earth re-radiates, the surface of the Earth re-radiates some of the energy absorbed through longer wavelength energy, such as infrared. However, through greenhouse gases such as O2, O3, carbon dioxide, and water vapor, they reabsorb and re-radiate back these outgoing infrared radiation back onto the Earth, further warming up the Earth. Next, I'm going to talk about combating these climate changes, which we can do so by basically setting the net heat flux to 0, which would, in theory, lead to no transfer of heat going on, so the Earth won't be heating up. And some proposed theories and ideas are geoengineering, which include increasing reflectivity, as seen here, of higher energy, shorter wavelength lights back at the atmosphere back into the space. Or we could also increase the emittance of longer energy wavelengths of the surface to then re-radiate back into the outside the atmosphere. And there's also efforts to grow trees and reduce carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. Thank you for listening, and this was my brief introduction to my project of heat transfer and climate change.